You're listening to the I Love You Keep Going podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
So welcome everybody. This is I Love You Keep Going. It's December 8th, 2022 at 7:36 p.m. Pacific time. And I don't think we really finished talking about mentalizing enough. We started last week on it, and I thought maybe we would continue a little bit more about it. But mainly talking about the patterns of mentalizing and the assets and deficits that brings focusing on the early period. We learn to mentalize from our caregivers in the way that they interact with us when we're children, when we're infants, starting right at the very beginning. Human babies, are born quite prematurely in comparison to other species and are incapable of survival, really incapable of much. A newborn infant can't roll over, for instance, or sit up. I don't know whether you have that sense of babies if you've never been around them or spent much time. And then, they, if you've ever been around them, you see that they do thousands of these little tiny baby crunches, trying to sit up, strengthen their muscles, and they learn to roll over, and they learn to creep, which is where they sort of slide themselves along the floor because they can't really lift themselves up on all four. And then when they get up on all four and they can crawl, that's when the exploration begins. They go from crawling to pulling themselves up on anything that's around them, and then they go through a period of learning to balance by holding on to things and moving around in the space where they can hold on to things and balance themselves. And then about 10 months or a year old, they have some mobility on two feet. But in that early crucible of the interaction with the caregiver, where actually the whole experience of the world is in the face of the caregiver, it's the reflection in the face of the caregiver that's received, which is the information about the nature of yourself and where you begin to construct the working model of self, who you are, what your assets are, what your deficits are, all happen in that early experience of self. We talk about the self, of course, in Buddhism as this not substantial, solid, ongoing, continuous experience, but that something that arises based on conditioning in each moment. The sense of self arises based on the conditions of the present moment. So in each moment, the sense of self that arises is slightly different. A pattern of sensing experience is taken in, touching, seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling. Mind, of course, is the activity of cherry picking the things out of the environment that we're going to use to create this experience of the world in the moment that we're there. And in that cherry picking, we're also cherry picking the sensing experiences that react to our conditioning that create the sense of self that arises in the moment to experience what we've created. That sense of duality of this is the self experiencing, what's out there is all one experience. So when understand duality as the appearance of the self being other than the sensing experience, but actually it's just all one experience. The database gets built up in these early reflections in the face of the caregiver or the people that are around us. We present ourselves authentically in an effort to get our needs met without knowing what it is that we're doing or communicating in that sense. And then our hopefully sensitive enough caregiver empathetically attunes to us and begins to decode our very particular expressions and understand their meaning, and then, if they're able to do so, provide a good enough response to it so that we have a sense of being seen and being known and being valued by the person. Delight is one of the currencies of secure functioning, that we have a sense that we're delightful. So in a good enough relationship with a caregiver, that sense of delight is abundant enough that we generally regard ourselves as delightful, even when we're distressed and demanding. We have a sense, because it's given to us, that we are delightful, and that we're valuable, and that we're not too much, that our caregivers have resources to be able to respond to us in any of our manifestations. And then if that isn't what happens, we develop a working model that's different than that secure model. Peter Fonagy and Anthony Bateman at the Tavistock Clinic, which is part of the Anna Freud Center in London, developed this map of the early mentalizing experience that arises from the interactions with the caregivers, and they talked about it in 4 dimensions. In one dimension, I like to call it spontaneity and monitoring. They would call it automatic or controlled. The reason I like spontaneity better is because we're a meditation group and we're talking about mindfulness. We're being mindful of the experience of the present moment, and automatic tends to suggest that you're not necessarily mindful of what's happening. And then monitoring is continuously monitoring. So in that dimension, not interfering with the experience of sensing, but at the same time continuously monitoring it. What you'll notice in an over-monitoring situation, for instance, is that the sensing experience becomes quite inhibited. If we use auditory thinking as an example for that, you might notice that the always chatty mind that you have completely shuts down when you bring your attention to auditory thinking space, and it's just completely quiet. So that's an over-monitoring situation. So you have to loosen up the mind and allow the spontaneous flow, but then you don't want to get swept up into the content of what the talk is and lose the monitoring position. The second one is self and other, that you have a sense of your own experience, and you have a clear distinction between the experience of others. In Buddhism, often we talk about self and world, but what we really mean is ourselves and other people, because other people are the thing that we know, the information about ourselves, even in adult relationships after childhood. The main way that we have a sense of how we are being in the moment that we're being as it's reflected off the experiences of other people of what's happening. I like to talk about this in terms of emotional clarity, partly. You have the emotional reaction to the present moment. You have self-generated emotion, which is meant to be regulating. You have somaticized emotional experience, which is the old stuff that's stored in the body. And you have the capacity for the empathetic experience of other people when you're in connection to them. So that when you have a clear experience of self, those first 3 are there. Clear understanding of what the emotional response of the present moment is. You're able to monitor your thoughts and understand that each thought has an emotional component to it. You're able to track that. You're able to track the background, old stuff that's held in the body and can be reactive to the present moment. And you're actually able to track the empathetic experience of the other person, which gives you an indication of them, and you can hold your own emotional experiences separate from the empathetic experience and notice the interaction between them. You have a reaction to the empathetic experience you have, and the person that you're in relationship to has a reaction to their empathetic experience of you, which you can track in the empathetic experience of them. So there's an exchange when you're really connected and can feel into each other and have good clarity about the separation of the two experiences. And then there's a sensitivity to the differences in conditioning that cause you to create an experience of the present moment which is different than the experience of the present moment that they're creating, even though in some sense you're sharing the experience of the present moment. Your perspective of the present moment is based on your conditioning. Theirs is based on their conditioning, and because they're different, you create different versions of the same shared experience. And this is something that's important to understand and actually really value, because you get information from that you wouldn't be able to get on your own, because you can compare the experience that you've created of what's happening in the present moment with theirs, and in some ways expand into or use their database to create a different perspective on what's actually happening. The third dimension is internal versus external. We have the capacity to allow information about what's actually happening, and we also have the capacity to limit or filter what we allow ourselves to know about what's happening. So, for instance, dismissing people have a tendency to restrict information about emotional experience that they might be having, and it can get quite severe in the amount of information that they restrict, so that they don't have any sense of emotions in the body. Sometimes they can cut off the body but still have a cognitive understanding what of emotions are, but they also have the capacity to eliminate awareness of that and not know what their emotional response is to anything. That's quite a severe restriction. But in internal, external, there's the capacity of allowing yourself to know everything about yourself. And when you look at the neurobiology of this and the limited capacity that we have anyway, it's quite startling. And I find one of the more amusing things about the conscious human condition, the research is ongoing, of course. One of the things about using any aspect of science in a discussion is that the science is ongoing, and so it's constantly changing, and so that there's in understanding the nature of that is it's a constantly updating thing with the way it goes. But right now, 11 million bits per second is the capacity of the sensing body that you live in, if you're fully sensed. But the width of consciousness, the width of information that the self experience gets in each moment is only 16 out of 11 million. So that to say that the self is the author and the doer and the organizer and the creator of the actions that you take is humorous when you look at that equation. Actually, what you are is the witness to what you do in the self-experience rather than being the organizer and doer. Is that making sense? So you're watching what you do from the self perspective. In case you decide on some really boneheaded move, and you can intervene, that's the controlled side, just in time to avert some disaster of your own making. Have you ever started a sentence, looked at the expression of the face of the person that you're talking to, and cut it off? that would be a case of what I'm talking about. Oops, I didn't mean that at all. In Buddhism, of course, we're talking about enlightenment, and enlightenment is really to understand the nature of the human condition and be present for the experience of it. That's what we really mean. And so all of these things are pointers to that, how we begin to understand this activity that we're engaged in. So my Georgeness or your Joanness or your Christianness, all coming from that database and the way that we assemble it in the moment. And if we're clear about it and can really see the pieces, that is to say, we can mentalize fast enough to understand our reaction to the present moment, how we're formulating it, and then maybe adjust it so that it's really skillful before we allow it to be expressed, which would be the external aspect of it. And then also, how do we understand other people? We see the external presentation of other people and we interpret a meaning of it. And sometimes if we have a good empathetic connection to them, we can feel into their emotional being and compare them and get a sense of whether there's congruency there. We also need to track that they do what they say they're going to do and don't do what they say they're not going to do, so that we really have integrity in there. A lot of us in childhood learn to split off that, what they do and what they say piece, because we can't add up the family system that we live in if we have to connect that. And then the fourth aspect is the cognitive versus affective or emotional experience. In the West, it's this these poles. One side is thinking, one side is feeling. In Buddhism, we don't really have that. All thought has an emotional component to it. I always think back to my days in film school, when they would show a film, which would have the visual, it would have the auditory, and it would have the music, the feeling, and that could create a very vivid experience of cinema. But if you pulled any one of them away from that, it greatly diminished the impact of it, because all of them come together to create a sense of reality that we have. Simply the auditory, simply the visual, without the feeling sense, doesn't have the same depth of reality that when they're all together. But understanding auditory and visual thinking and understanding emotion and how they come together to create that rich experience of aliveness. Christian.
George, the avoidant children they don't develop like the effective mentalization skills, but they can develop the cognitive
Right.
skill. Does that mean that their caretaker wasn't closely kind of face-to-face mirroring and marking their affective states for them to not get that portion?
The avoidance strategy develops early from profound neglect. So part of that neglect is a lack of enough time with the face mirroring back the experience of the child so that they can identify it. The other thing that happens from neglect, of course, is that it's frightening and painful to be have that sense of being abandoned, that sense of being rejected. And because there's no help from the caregiver to teach the child how to regulate those experiences, the child begins to learn to suppress them as a way of survival, really. It's so there's no feedback, and then the child is left to its own devices to figure out a way to regulate those experiences. And the solution that children come up with is to prevent the experience of them arising in consciousness. It doesn't mean that they don't have the feeling states. They do have the feeling states. It just means they don't have conscious awareness of the feeling states. So in studying children in the strange situation, they did put EEGs on kids to see what was going on in the body with them. And they found that the anxious avoidant kids were the ones that were in the most distress, but they were also the ones that had no external presentation of being in distress. And one of the thoughts they had was that because they don't have conscious awareness of being in distress, they never seek help for the distress from anyone. It simply stays unconscious. And so they have distressing experiences which they don't make any attempt to regulate in any way. And so they get to be more intense.
So that means they have like poor interoception?
Yes. Hesh?
Yeah, I might have maybe this is a question about discernment, and since you seem to be able to hold the entire model in your head at once, I can ask you. So when I hear you talking about mentalizing, it sounds like an experience that I can recognize as maybe view, or maybe conditioning and internal imagery asserting itself into a view. What are the components of it in mindfulness that I can kind of maybe look at to see the whole?
So what you would want to be able to do is track auditory thinking, visual thinking, and the emotional experience in the body. And as you formulate conceptual reality using Vipassana, you would want to be able to trace the memory threads that are activated when you create the experience of the present moment, so that you have some sense of what conditioning response it is that you're having. And then what you want to be able to do is compare what's happening in the present moment to the conditioned thread to see if they line up enough. And then also to see that you're responding to the present moment and not responding to what happened in the conditioned thread. If that makes sense.
It does. My follow-up then is about that thread. How do you hold that thread in equanimity? Because it seems like the driven response would be to suppress it, maybe.
I think that well, in the process of actively mentalizing, and of course you hold it in the past. What often happens to people that have unresolved the conditioned experiences is that the experience of them being in the past is lost, and they can become experiences as if they're in the present, and overwhelming in that way. But it's a little by little kind of thing. Once you get up to the speed of mentalizing, where you can begin to track that, and you can really hold things that have happened in the past and hold the present moment separately from them, the intensity of the experience of them is diminished. And when you do it enough times, each time they diminish to the point where they're no longer overwhelming. That's what I would say to that. In this formulation of taking the raw sensing data and forming it into conceptual reality, first the mind goes around and gathers the little bits of sensing data. Then this is all unconscious, preconscious. The evaluation of how urgent it is, how much attention it needs is made. If it's urgent, it goes to the head of the line. It's then compared to the perceptual database for an experience that's close enough to it that the meaning, the conditioned meaning attaches to the experience of the present moment. And then that folds open into conceptual reality. And then the intention for the response to the interpretation of conceptual reality forms. And then you're free to take an action in response to what formulation you created. And adequate mentalizing would be that you could follow that whole process, and in the intention part of it, evaluate whether your response makes sense given the actual conditions of the present moment. And when you tend to take actions that are not so in line with the present moment, it's usually because you've lost track of the present moment and are just in the flow of the conditioning, and you're responding as you've habitually responded to things like that. That makes sense. I like the quantum physics model too. In each moment, every single possibility that you could choose that's available in that moment is available. But we do get into these ruts of samsara where we just pick over and over again from this very limited selection of possibilities. Each time we do, of course, all of the other possibilities disappear, and it's just the one that we pick that forms the next moment. And then all of the possibilities that are tied to that previous choice is what opens up. So that you can get into these vicious cycles of over and over again repeating conditioned behavior, which can be terribly defeating and painful, which doesn't mean that in each moment all of the other choices weren't there. They were there, you just didn't see them, you just didn't pick them.
Sorry, I wanted to ask the follow-up question from what I'm hearing from you. Congruency has come up in what you've described a few times. Is congruency then a byproduct of this process, or is that another intentional effort?
How are you meaning it?
Like emotional congruency, like you were talking about, when the other sees you, they're able to tell if you're in a congruent expression mode.
That would take somebody who knows you really well, and would also probably take some inquiry. I don't know about you, but I totally flunked high school telepathy. And didn't take it in college. This is what I think is going on. It's a good statement. This is what's going on. It's not a good statement. This is what I think is going on. What do you think is going on? Is a wonderful basis for communication. This is what you said to me, and this is the effect that it had on me. Was that the intention of your expression? Is a good way to inquire about something that's hurtful. And if it was actually an accurate understanding of what it is, and it was hurtful, then you have a ground for dialogue about it. You did this. So that's such a fertile ground, because the anger shuts everybody down, creates a defensiveness to it. And often what you're noticing is that the big self-experience is what's happening. And then we get lost in identification with the big self-experience, and we need to defend the big wounded self, or the big angry self, or the big frightened self. And actually that's insubstantial. You can let that come and go, and continue to seek closeness and understanding. The more secure you are, of course, in your connection to other people, it's that kind of dialogue is less frightening because you don't worry about being rejected or abandoned in it. You worry about being seen and understood, and you worry about seeing the other person and understanding them more than you do about being abandoned and lost to the difficult world we live in. That makes sense. If you look at the development of mentalizing and the attachment systems that arise in secure attachment, right out of the gate, most people can mentalize well enough and have this dynamic range of in the early mentalizing experience. That means when they show up at the playground at 4 or 5 years old, they have a basis for communicating and for interacting with the world and interacting with other people and doing the assignments of socializing and learning and all of the rest of it pretty well. And then you notice that other people are less able to do that. And so that early platform is what offers us a springboard, if you will, into the later developments, and the lack of those foundations actually inhibit or restrict our capacities. And so as life goes on, the lack of mentalizing skills can be quite inhibiting in terms of moving ahead with what needs to happen. In the development of collaborative relational systems, which is the foundation of secure functioning, when you don't have a responsive enough caregiver, and this is somebody who responds 30% of the time or better, which is an astonishingly low bar. I think when you look at the success of the human species on the globe, you would need something that was an astonishingly low bar to make sense of how we go. But dismissing people because nobody comes to them, they don't move out of this original auto-regulating stance. We all come into the world as auto-regulators. And then if people come well enough and respond to us well enough, we reorient toward external regulation. But because nobody really comes well enough for an avoidant child, they stay in that auto-regulating space. One of the reasons why they learn to suppress their emotions is a way of dealing with the difficulties of having to only auto-regulate, is because it's too painful otherwise. And because they don't have actual help from anybody else, they don't have options to do differently. Christian?
But avoidant children, like, they learn to become good explorers, I guess, generally. So are they actually being encouraged in their exploration by their caregivers in some way? Or is it just kind of like, you know, like whatever our attachment styles, we're learning how to get our care, and we're learning to respond in a way that's going to get us cared for. And so are they just learning to become good explorers because that's just what they have to do with themselves, or they're actually doing that as a response to the caregiver encouraging just that, but not encouraging the effective part?
Well, you might call it a pseudo exploration rather than the vital exploration of a secure person. So a secure child begins exploration when they're able to actually locomote away from the caregiver and explore things. So we're talking creeping, they don't get very far, but crawling they do. And a child will crawl, say, to the middle of the room and look back for encouragement, and if they get encouragement, they'll be emboldened to go further, and then they'll get to a doorway and they'll look back and they'll crawl out of the door and crawl right back in, looking to see that the caregiver is there and supporting them. And the more reliable the caregiver is, the greater the distances that they get to explore. That would be a secure response. And then the child discovers something and they rush back to the caregiver, and they can't wait to share their discovery with the caregiver. And the caregiver then has the opportunity to delight in the child's discoveries and go through that with the child. And then the child learns that their interests are important, and what their perspective is important, and something valuable that they can share with somebody who's interested in their perspective. But this isn't what really a dismissing person is doing. What you'll notice in dismissing or anxious avoidant children is they explore because nobody inhibits them from going. They don't come back because there's nothing to come back to. Often, if they're restricted in some way, or they have to perform in some way to satisfy the caregivers, and their actual interests aren't rewarded, they learn to keep those secret and perform in the way that they need to in order to get their needs met. So they don't give up on getting their needs met. They don't learn to collaborate with other people to meet those needs in the way that secure people do. So we would say that they get really focused on secondary exploration, which is the acquiring of resources to transact the kind of care that they want. So they tend to go for social positions or money or some kind of resource that they can then use to trade for the kind of care that they want as adults, which is very different than a secure person collaborating with somebody else, mutually caring for each other. If somebody comes good enough that you reorient toward external regulation, but they're not reliable enough that you can predict how to elicit a response from them. So secure kids, they make a gesture, the caregiver sensitively attunes them, understands what the gesture is, and then provides the care that the child wants. The child understands in doing that if I make this gesture, I can get that care. And so they begin to move out of the externally focused into the collaborative experience of care. I need this, I make this expression, and then my caregiver meets my needs. And as I get older, I understand that my caregiver is separate from me, that they have an agenda and I have an agenda, that I can collaborate with them so that each of our agendas can be met in a way that provides the care that I need. That collaborative balance. That doesn't happen with a dismissing person. And with a preoccupied person, because the care is too inconsistent for them to be able to understand what to do to get the care that they want, they don't develop that sense of security, that sense of collaboration with a caregiver. And then they don't have that capacity when they hit the playground and move into the mid-childhood development period. Is that making sense? So that what we talk about in terms of using meditation to train mentalizing is to begin to understand the maps of assets and deficits that we have based on our early conditioning, and train the deficits. One of the things that I find the most charming about this is that most people would prefer to train the skills they already have than to have to go through the learning of the skills that they don't have, because one is pleasurable and one is challenging. So it's that moving away from pain toward pleasure concept that the Buddha talked about. And here we have to really insist that we train the deficits. Christian?
So do you find in the kind of modular way that you teach Vipassana, like mentalization skills, that that maps pretty consistently with your students' attachment styles, or like whatever the AAI said, that they'll struggle with a certain Vipassana skill or meditation type and excel at others, and it's pretty consistent?
It is with organized, insecure people. So secure people and organized, insecure people, that's pretty consistent. With disorganized people, it's still all over the place. It's harder to tell.
Mhm.
But you know, for instance, a dismissing person typically doesn't have any memory before puberty. One of the ways that they learn to emotionally regulate is to focus intentionally away from anything that has an emotional content to it. They're very material oriented, object oriented. They learn to be object oriented because objects don't typically produce much in the way of emotion, and they're looking for an emotionless existence because emotions are painful. But human memory requires a strong emotion in order to make it from short-term memory into long-term memory. And because they're focusing so much on things that have no emotion, they don't remember anything because they don't succeed in passing the short-term to long-term transition because the emotional content is too little. Or the experiences are really bad and they suppress those. So with a dismissing person, you wouldn't necessarily say, oh, let's try and dig up all the memories of your childhood because the only ones they're going to remember are bad. And who wants that? Particularly when you don't need them to repair the mentalizing capacity or the attachment conditioning. That makes sense. So we're economical in that way. Preoccupied people don't monitor anything. They just respond. It's when you can't predict what you have to do to get the response you want, you just have to keep going through presentations until you hit one that works. And because there's no consistency moment to moment, you just keep rolling through them. It doesn't matter whether you track them or not, because if it succeeds, even if it succeeds in this moment, there's no likelihood that it will succeed in the next moment. Is that making sense? So what's the point in tracking? That doesn't get you what you need, and it takes too much energy. So you can see why these things happen. And then preoccupied people tend to not remember so much about themselves, but they remember a lot about other people. So they're good resources for other people, memories of their experience of other people, but since they don't track their own experience, they don't remember their own experience. So these are the kinds of patterns that you can see when you do these investigations. Disorganized people, fearfully preoccupied, fearfully avoidant, tend to go one way or the other, like organized people do, but complexly disorganized people that could present anything. So, that they can do that is one way that you have a sense of the level of disorganization. Joan?
So how do you categorize a child who may look dismissive? So it looks very controlled on the outside and it's not expressive, but on the inside has access to emotion, and it could feel extreme.
Then you're probably looking at a passively preoccupied. So we track different things. Role reversal or involvement in the mind state of the caregiver is the thing that causes preoccupation. But if you add to that rejection, then that's what creates that particular formulation. The child learns that they can't make any authentic expression about themselves. That's the cutoff part that looks like the dismissing person, but they have the chaotic internal life of a preoccupied person.
So
go ahead.
No, would that be, you said disorganized or passively?
No, passively preoccupied is an insecure organized strategy.
Okay.
Yeah, oftentimes the assumption is that they're dismissing because they're cut off, but they're not. Dismissing people are cut off from themselves, and passively preoccupied people are not cut off from themselves. They cut themselves off from other people. That's why when you're looking at them, it has a similar appearance.
Okay.
And they keep that expression secret, which is also something that dismissing people do. Dismissing people really keep the central core of their life secret because of the rejection that they experience in childhood.
So the common factor is rejection,
Yeah.
or a sense of rejection.
Normally you have dismissing from neglect, but sometimes neglect has a rejecting component. The childhood of profound neglect has, in addition to that, rejection. That creates a much more cut off person. But you can also have the rejection in relationship to preoccupation. You see it in eating disorders, for instance. It's common to have the involving role reversing and the rejection. That's one of the hallmarks of that. So what do you think? Shall we do some meditation? We can either go the metta way or we can go the vipassana way. What do you think? Metta. Vipassana.
Why not both?
It's a tie.
I did meta today once, so I'll be the tiebreaker. We'll go Vipassana.
All right. So go ahead and take your meditation posture.
A lot of subliminal talk.
Oh, good. Yeah. You mean it didn't ever burst into clear talk?
Yeah, like muttering, but repetitive, you know? There was some emotion generated, but nothing like a super potent.
Good. Good insight. Someone else?
Dealing with the hindrance of sloth and torpor.
Yes. It's late.
It is.
Yeah. Reminds me of that Mary Oliver poem. It's already late. Stand up, open the eyes, walk. Those are the remedies to sloth and torpor.
Indeed. I just got back from a retreat, so there was some standing indeed.
Good.
Yeah.
Or just succumb to the deliciousness of falling asleep.
Oh yeah. Yeah. It was funny because who was it? I don't know. When I was talking to somebody and they did a retreat in Burma, and it was like a month long with a bunch of monks. And then he opened his eyes during the retreat one time and saw this monk at the front of the stage. Just like, he's like, well, at least it's not me, just me.
Yeah. When we were there, Santa said, "You're getting off easy." And I said, "Oh yeah, what's that?" And he said, "You don't have to be in Zendo until 4:30. We're a Vipassana retreat. You have to be here at 3:30."
Oh God.
So there, a lot of that.
Yes, very hardcore.
Mhm. Anything else?
Do you bring your back scrubber for the chanting on those retreats, George?
There, on those retreats, the chanting was in the evening at 10 p.m. So you start the day at 4, and then be chanting at 10 p.m. Long day. So we have the holidays coming up. So really for the rest of the year, we're not doing that much. But then in January, we are going to start a new level 1 in Pacific time. And then a level 2. And then we're going to do another level 1 in EU time in April, I think it is. And then I'm doing a in-person retreat in Utrecht in June, which is in the Netherlands. It's about a half hour south of Amsterdam. And I think that takes us all the way into July of next year. We'll be doing a couple of level 1s and a second round of level 2 over the summer here, and then in the fall we'll do one in EU time, our first level 2 in EU time, so if you know people over there. Because it is the holidays and some gift giving might be in line, we have new merch in case you want to take a look at it. We have 3 new t-shirts. A new I Love You Keep Going, a new Meta Against the Machine, and the first version of Always Cool, Always Kind, which I think is a lovely idea for a shirt. We have a new chapbook on secure attachment, in case you want a primer on that. And then I have a new book called Punch Outs. So 3 or 4 days to get the shirts and so on, and then it takes about 8 days or so to get a book. So if you want that, my marketing guy told me to make this pitch. So that's, I'm dutifully complying. Plus, it is a beautiful book. I like books.
George, how did you come up with those bracelets?
Oh, these are t-shirts. Well, we've been doing Meta Against the Machine for a while. It was.
Don't you have bracelets though?
We have bracelets.
What's up? Do you have the What Would Jesus Do bracelets?
No, I have one that says, "What's the secure choice? Do that."
Okay. I probably need one. Yeah.
I have one that says, "Compassionate resistance, kind action." I love you. Keep going. Of course. May you be peaceful. We have one of those.
What happened to love people and feed them?
You know, since all of the meditation centers closed and there's no in-person, it's hard to hand out dollar bills to people and say, give them away. He's referring to when I first started teaching meditation, and I would ask people, or I would say that generosity was the entrance into the path. Since we don't really teach generosity in the West, it's very hard for people to grasp that. And so then I would say, give $1 to a homeless person if they ask, without considering whether they deserve it or not. And nobody would do it because there was a scarcity mentality. So then I started stamping dollar bills with love people and feed them and giving them to the people who came to the meditation classes, with the instruction to give them away to a homeless person if somebody asked, without evaluating whether they deserved it or not. There's a lot of, for instance, if a homeless person came up and they were drunk, a lot of people have this idea that they shouldn't help them because they're causing their own suffering. But we don't have a good way of judging how somebody ended up in front of us in the way that they are. So, and then people began to give away the dollars because it wasn't their dollar and they were instructed to it. Plus, I would give them another $1 if they gave away the $1 that I gave them. And then they begin to have the experience of generosity, which was actually quite amazing. So I don't know whether you know this or not, but they made a documentary film about it. That I ended, of course, on the cutting room floor because they took the opinion that mentally ill homeless people should be forced into treatment, which I didn't support.
Anecdotally, you also had to set your stamper up because people at the end of the class wanted to stamp their own money because they were
Yes, they
so
did.
enthralled with the practice.
Well, you know what? Hilariously, maybe or maybe not. Can you see this? I love you. Keep going. I love people who feed them, which is somebody. It's a $2 bill. I only gave away dollar bills, so it stands it and gave it to me. Anyway. You may have heard that, sorry, I'm back on my soapbox. In New York, they're now rounding people up and declaring that they're mentally ill and institutionalizing them, whether they want to go or not. Which is heartbreaking. Anyway, really appreciate your practice. Thank you for coming. We'll see you soon, I hope, somewhere along the path. I am going to take the week off between Christmas and New Year's, so we won't have a meeting then, but we will all of the other times. See you soon. Bye.